everyone, I'm Ishika.
And I'm Akshay.
The thing about wildlife is anyone can fall in love with it through science, photography, literature, or innocent observation. Sharing their love today is Nisarg Prakash, an engineer turned wildlife biologist who has dedicated a large portion of the last decade to studying and conserving otters in India, predominantly along the expansive stretch of the Kaveri River in Karnataka. Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of The Thing About Wildlife. Thanks so much for joining us again on the third week of our podcast. Today's episode is actually the first one we ever recorded, and so it might sound a tad different from what you've heard already. A big shout out to Nisarg Prakash, who agreed to be our guinea pig and sit in as our first ever guest over a year ago. We hope you enjoy listening to his stories as much as we did. Back to the episode.
So, Nisarg Prakash, can you tell us about yourself, who you are, what you do?
Hi, I'm a wildlife biologist and I study otters along rivers, mostly in South India. This work began nearly a decade ago when I did my master's dissertation in the Annamalai Hills. And after that, I moved to the Cauvery, where I continued working on the small clawed and the smooth-coated otters.
Awesome. And why did you want to be an ecologist?
Well, I was always fascinated by the outdoors, even as a kid. Remember going to my grandparents' place in Coorg, waiting for elephants, looking at the hills. So it was something that interested me way back in school, and it stayed alive even during engineering. And then I didn't feel like taking up a regular job. I wanted to work in conservation, and that led to a master's in wildlife biology and conservation at NCBS.
So you mentioned that you had done engineering. What was it that was the turning point for you that made you decide that you want to pursue ecology professionally?
There was actually no turning point. I was always interested in ecology. I just did engineering because I didn't really have an option then. But I studied in a really nice landscape, a lot of secondary forest around where I was, a lot of walks, hikes. So that kind of kept my interest going and kind of spurred me along.
You mentioned that you studied otters for your MSc with NCBS. Can you tell us a little bit both about NCBS and why otters caught your attention?
My first interaction with otters was way back in 2006 or 7 in the Kabini backwaters in Bandipur. I was just walking along and I suddenly see these 3 otters that come out of nowhere. And that was the first time seeing otters for me, smooth-coated otters. And I didn't really give it much thought then, but that image always stayed with me. Then I went on to do my master's at NCBS. It's a wildlife biology and conservation program co-run by NCBS and the Center for Wildlife Studies now. The period I spent there, the 2 years I spent there, was in some sense formative because it introduced me to concepts, theory, methods, but I also got to meet a lot of people from the field, lectures, which kind of, I guess, shaped my thinking in some sense, not fully, but was quite instrumental. And at the end of that, the final year, we all have to do our field dissertations. That's when I chose to go to the Annamalai Hills because that's a landscape that's really close to me. And from my previous trips, I'd figured that there are otters in tea plantations. And to me, it seemed very strange that tea plantations that are so different from tropical rainforests that's all around could still support otters. The tea plantations are the most extreme form of degradation that you see in a landscape like that. There are almost no trees. There is no riverside vegetation. The character of the places has changed. and I was still finding otters, and I was wondering why. So that was my question. I was looking at how land use, be it tea plantations, coffee plantations, affect use of the landscape by otters as compared to the rainforest that's nearby.
Since you mentioned that it was unusual that you realized otters can be found in teak plantations, can you tell our listeners why that is unusual and what a typical habitat for an otter would be?
Yeah. So the otters I studied in the Annamalai Hills in the Valparai Plateau are the small floored otters. Uh, they are the smallest species in the world. Of the 13 found, this is the smallest. And they are usually found in hilly areas, Western Ghats, the Northeast, shallow water streams, fast flowing streams, not so much along large rivers. Uh, that's interesting because their primary diet is crustaceans, crabs, and they usually turn rocks over, look under things to find crabs. So that's kind of indicative of their habitat. And the streams and tea plantations were once streams flowing through forested areas. And these are also shallow streams, fast flowing streams, clear water streams. And I went there thinking already had this hypothesis in my mind, which said forests will have high use of otters, streams by otters. Coffee plantations, which retain some characters in terms of canopy, trees, vegetation, will come second, and tea plantations, which are completely on the opposite end of the spectrum, no trees, no canopy, no hardly any vegetation along the river, will be at the other end. I thought tea plantations would support very few otters as compared to the tropical forests, evergreen forests. But at the end of my study, what my results were showing me was there is almost no difference amongst the three land use types, that the tea plantations, coffee plantations, and the evergreen forests. And now otters were using them. They were all relatively well used. And that to me came as a surprise because that's not what I expected to find. And this is something that's come back to bite me, if I might say, over and over again, because I always had this image in mind of otters being very symbolic or emblematic of free flowing rivers, unspoiled rivers, uh, good riparian habitats, which can't take too much disturbance. But following upon my work in the animalized, when I went to the Kaveri, if I may continue here, is again a really interesting system. I don't like using the word system, but it actually is very interesting because the Kaveri is 330 kilometers long in the state of Karnataka, and of these 330 kilometers, only the last 110 kilometers of the river is protected as part of the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary. The rest 220 kilometers of the river is mostly flowing through the plains, uh, uh, lot of agriculture, settlements. There's one large dam, a number of mini hydels along the way, uh, intensive fishing, very high sand mining, dynamite fishing. And the initial 70 odd kilometers is through Coorg, which is close to the source, foothills of the Western Ghats, and all of that. Uh, you most in Coorg district, you mostly have coffee plantations, paddy fields, small patches of forests. So the Kaveri is this mosaic of habitats, going from very good riparian forest at the end of the river in the state to very high use in the middle and mixed use at the start.
Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating, especially the fact about how you went in with the expectation that forests are better than tea, which seems like a reasonable expectation, and then nature had its way of fooling you, and you say it's come to bite you in the back in the sense. Can you elaborate a little more on that? And before you do that, could you just highlight the differences between the two species of otters that you studied? Because Valparai to Kaveri, there are two different species, right? So can you tell our listeners what they are?
Right. So, like I mentioned, the small-clawed otter is mostly adapted to life in fast-flowing streams, hill streams, shallow water streams, forested habitats. Not so much along big rivers, but they do occur in some places. The smooth-coated otter, on the other hand, is an otter of the plains, is an otter of the large river, medium to large-sized rivers. The smooth-coated otter mostly preys on fish. It's fundamentally a fish eater. More than 95% of its prey is fish, and their preferred habitat is the river and the plains, meandering rivers flowing through agricultural areas, landscapes. Uh, yeah, violence and these features. And the Kaveri has both these species. The small-clawed otter in the initial 60 to 70 kilometers in Coorg district, and there's a small zone of overlap between the small-clawed and the smooth-coated, and smooth-coated otter takes over from there well into the plains and into the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary. There's potentially a third species, the Eurasian otter, also along in the headwaters of the Kaveri. It's been recently rediscovered, though I never found evidence of it during my study. Why I say what I've been finding in field comes back to bite me is I've always gone with a certain expectation. I know how to find otters, I know where to look, I know I'll find them. Uh, but I've also, in some sense, been this, if I may say, uh, arrogant wildlife biologist going to field thinking I know what's already happening when I actually haven't probably started work properly there. Uh, like, for example, just to give you an example, the Eurasian otter, there were no records in the last 7 decades. And I grew up, I spent a good part of the last decade and a half saying Eurasian otters didn't occur in South India. And historic records might have been labeling mistakes. And this is what I believed. I kept telling everybody, saying, there were no Eurasian otters here to start with. And suddenly, out of the blue, one morning I get a call saying there's been a roadkill of an otter in the Anamala Hills in Valparai. And they sent me the photographs, and I look at it, and it's an Eurasian otter. And I spent quite a bit of time in Valparai, and all my walks along streams, forests, hills, I never did once come across evidence I thought was Eurasian otter. I didn't get them on my camera traps. And now suddenly I wake up one morning and I have images on my phone that say it's an Eurasian otter. I was shocked. And then after that one particular, it's really unfortunate because it was a roadkill. Uh, but it's kind of, after that, I kept following up. There were records after that from north of the Palghat Gap, from Coorg recently, from Bhadra, from Satpura in central India, from the Kana landscape, and also recently from Lake Chilika on the eastern coast. So suddenly there are these spurt of records of Eurasian otters from all over the country. We always knew that they were there along the Himalayas, but mainland India, yeah, and that kind of uh, tells me how little I know about them and the systems, and why I shouldn't be jumping to conclusions so easily. Yeah, so that's my story of Eurasian otters. I still follow up on recent records, and it doesn't surprise me anymore when suddenly I hear of a Eurasian otter report from anywhere in the country, because I think they are capable of turning up in places we can least expect them to.
So this brings us to kind of ask you what makes the Eurasian otter so special. Why is it so surprising that it is found in further south from the Himalayas, and also why these records may be popping up? Are they moving? Have they always been there? Do you have any idea what the theory behind it could be?
Yeah, so the Eurasian otter, now that I've followed all these recent records, well, the Eurasian otter always was the otter with the largest distribution across the globe, starting from Western UK all the way to Korea and the Palearctic, and all the way down to Sri Lanka and parts of Malaysia. So it doesn't surprise me, but the last 7 decades, 7 to 8 decades, there were absolutely no records, and probably that's because we weren't looking for them. Yes, we lots of people have camera trapped in forests for various reasons, mostly large carnivores. Uh, but I guess we didn't look for them in the right places, didn't place camera traps that were meant to be placed for otters, because you can't always set up a camera trap and expect to capture everything from that. And it's not that these otters have always been there. It's just that sightings have not sightings, reports have increased now because more people are looking for them, or more people are camera trapping in places that weren't camera trapped much earlier. uh, Chilka, people didn't camera trap much earlier. There was a friend recently looking for fishing cats, and she happened to find both the Eurasian and the smooth-coated otter, both large otters using the same landscape. It's very fascinating and yeah, interesting. So I guess more people looking for it in places that were not earlier explored, that were places ignored earlier, in the plains and outside the well-known parks. And probably Eurasian otters occur at a relatively lower density compared to both the smooth-coated and small-fur otters. Smooth-coated otters are easy to find in the plains. One has to just probably ask fishermen who fish in that area, or spend a couple of days walking along the river to figure out if there are smooth-coated otters there or not. The problem is all of these otters have been heavily, in many places, heavily hunted, poached for their pelt, and probably even for their meat. And given if a river in the plains doesn't have otters anymore, it's only because of targeted poaching of them. It's probably because of no other reason that they have disappeared. And yeah, poaching is, this is one reason that led me to study otters in the first place, because I knew they were being poached out. And otters, by nature of the habitat that they use, very little of our streams and rivers are actually protected in protected areas. Uh, and because of this, otters are found outside in non-protected areas where there's all sorts of things happening. Uh, Water being diverted, dynamite fishing, a lot of poaching, fishing, intensive fishing with gill nets. So I was very interested in seeing how all of these, despite all of these things happening to the river, are otters managing to survive. So in some sense, I started off my work thinking otters are a very good metaphor for what's happening to Indian rivers. But by metaphors, I meant everything that's going wrong along a river. And I expected otters to mirror that trend. Few years into my work, I started realizing that maybe they are not good metaphors to what's happening to Indian rivers. Despite all of these things happening to their habitats, otters still seem to be surviving. They seem to be very resilient and adaptive to what's happening around them. And that's purely because of how they are as animals, as social animals, as carnivores, as being able to adapt quickly to fishing nets being strung all around their rivers, being able to take fish from the nets and not get entangled. Uh, they are extremely resilient, and that's very heartening to know that despite how badly our rivers are being treated, otters are still managing to cling on and survive. But that's not all the reason for hope, because it does tell us that we need to take better care of our rivers, and we can't expect otters to keep adapting and to stay resilient to everything that we're doing to the rivers. One day there is going to be a tipping point, and be it poaching or be it something else, otters will start to disappear.
Thanks for that, Nisarg. I think you've done a really great job in painting a picture of why otters and perhaps even other species that are very easily adaptable to some of the changes people make, how it's still important to conserve them and really study what's going on there. And no doubt through the years, you've made some very key observations and had some experiences which are really close to you, which leads me to wonder which of these three species that you've spoken to us about is the closest to you, or the one that you like the best, and why?
That's hard to say. I've never seen the Eurasian otter, so in India, so I wouldn't know much about it. But if I were to choose between the small cloud and the smooth coated, I would probably choose the smooth coated, uh, just because of how resilient it is, and watching them is just a joy. It's just they are smooth coated otters mostly live in large family groups, and you can see them play, you can see them hunt together. They survive fishing nets, they survive life in reservoirs, though it's not optimal habitat for them. Yeah, fish. Yeah, smooth coated otters are clearly my favorites among otter species.
You told us some very interesting insights that you got from your field research, both in Valparai, in the Anamalai Hills, as well as Coorg. Uh, we were just wondering if you could take our listeners through what an average day in field is like. Are you just sitting by a river watching things? Are you walking along rivers? What's it like start to finish? If you can give us a rundown.
Yeah. So a typical day during fieldwork depends on which part of the river I'm in. Uh, the worst place to be in along the river is the river in the plains. It's terrible. Villages and agriculture and everything happening along the river, sand mining. In some places, it's even depressing to see what's happening to the river, dynamiting and people doing all sorts of things along the river. It's not a pleasant place to be, but it's also the place where the smooth-coated otters are, and that's probably what keeps us going in these stretches of the river. Though there's very little riparian cover, not very few trees, uh, only a subset of the biodiversity that used to be there. No mugger crocodiles, probably all killed. Very few, hardly any soft-shell turtles. But then there are those days when you see a flock of Pacific golden plovers or a black bittern or a cinnamon bittern, uh, a group of otters playing in the river. Then it's all worth it. So day depends on also depends on what kind of work I'm doing. If my day, if I'm going to be talking to fishermen and other farmers living along the river, I would not be paddling. I would mostly be visiting villages or the riverside, looking at what catch there is for them that day, talking to them about the methods they use to fish, or if they've seen otters, what they think of them, what the trend has been over the years. But my favorite days are when I actually do field work along the river, which is mostly paddling close to the banks, checking out islands, seeing what riparian habitat exists, looking for signs of otters, uh, baiting near spots to see if they come out, looking for dens. Yeah, that day usually lasts till sundown. That is, or maybe 6:30, and then we camp along the river wherever we end the day and start again. So it's mostly either on a two-person kayak or an inflatable raft with a team of three or four paddling. The group is pretty self-sufficient. We carry everything we need, and end of the day is really good along the river. The sun going down, and it's a very peaceful time.
That sounds magical almost. And can you tell us a little bit about, you mentioned looking at signs. So what does that mean? Does it leave a signboard, or What's it like?
Yeah, sorry, I should have elaborated there. So, a lot of my fieldwork doesn't depend on me actually finding otters, because otters can be shy, uh, most species. Uh, so, I primarily look for signs they've left behind, like footprints. They would have rolled on a sandbank. There's a tail drag on in the sand. They'd have pooped. There's a scat somewhere. So I primarily look for these signs, and if I see otters, that's great. But I can't always depend on seeing otters, because they could be spending the day lying hidden somewhere in some vegetation, and I might have just gone past without knowing. But signs are there, which says that the animal's been there. These signs can't lie. So that's what I meant by looking for signs. I sometimes set up a camera trap if I think it's an interesting place to see what otter occurs, how many probably in a group are there at pups. So yeah.
So it seems like a lot of these things, especially the whereabouts of the otters, are not really in your control at all. So when you're planning a study like this, how much of the day-to-day activities are pre-planned, and how much can you actually predict?
Well, in field, nothing goes to plan. Uh, so all I, all we know is that we have this stretch of the river to cover, or these many kilometers to cover, and while doing the survey, yeah, we just keep going down river, and we always go down river, check both banks. There's not much, it's not in your control, so you just adapt to whatever circumstance there is and continue doing field work. For example, in 2013 was a big drought year, and we were doing our field work along the Kaveri. We hadn't even reached the the only big dam along the river, and well upstream the river had just completely dried up, and there's no way we could continue fieldwork because we just weren't finding anything. So that season we had to sit it out and resume again, yeah, after a few months, when after the rains. So, well, I think you just make plans on the fly when you're doing fieldwork.
You mentioned kayaking down the Kaveri, and and you've written this wonderful article on the experience of kayaking. What do you see as an ecologist kayaking? It must be different from, say, a professional kayaker who's probably wanting to reach destination A. What do you see?
Well, I'm on the river when I'm not doing fieldwork, primarily because it's just very peaceful, and you just let go. It's just, and the kayak is a perfect way to be on the river, because it's all you need is a paddle, and yeah, it's just a thin layer of air keeping you above the river, and you just paddle along, go with the current, and it's really peaceful. It's an amazing way to see what's happening along the river, to just soak in the sights. Uh, Also, I think that physical activity takes my mind off other things. Just the fact that one paddle after the next is all I can think. One to the next, one to the next, and I can't think of anything else. And some days my shoulders are dead from paddling. Uh, it's just a very nice feeling at the end of the day to have seen the river from so close, and you go at your own pace. You're not dependent on anybody. You see things you wouldn't otherwise get to see. So that's primarily one of the reasons. It's for me, it's a way to unwind. Uh, yeah, going back to the Kaveri or the Sharavathy or any other river. When I'm mentally in not a very good place, kayaking kind of takes my mind off it, and it's almost like hitting the reset button for me, and can be quite inspiring that there are rivers that I can paddle down despite everything that's happening to that river. Uh, Go down all the way to the sea, see the mangroves, see how clear the water is, uh, start to get used to the incoming tide and the outgoing tide. Yeah, I don't know. Along the Sharavathy, you see Malabar pied hornbills fly across the river. I haven't seen an otter, but others have seen an otter there. Yeah, it's almost like hitting a reset button for your mental state.
Yeah, that sounds about right, because I've had the privilege of kayaking with you in Coorg for a short duration, a short fraction of what you may have kayaked, and that was exactly everything that you said. I think just building off the kayak thing, I remember you telling us in other contexts of how you kayak down the Sharavathy, and there's something magical about kayaking into an ocean. Can you talk to that? Can you share what's different about that?
So me and a couple of friends actually wanted to kayak in a west flowing river that's more forested than the river in the plains. And we chose the Sharavathy because it's got the longest stretch flowing out into the sea in the western side. And so after the last dam at Gersopa, the river flows for approximately 40 kilometers and then joins the Arabian Sea at Honavar. And we do it every year over a span of 2 to 3 days. Uh, and we see the river change from the river in the hills when it's just gotten off the hills at the last dam to how the effect of the tides take over, how the water becomes saline, how I mean it's a beautiful river because there are no big towns along it, there are no industries along it, and the water is still relatively clean and very clear. And in the monsoon, it's really a great place to be. And as you get closer to the sea in the monsoon, especially, you can hear the waves breaking against the coast from miles away. And the rain just washes over. There's wind, the water gets choppy, but you know you're safe on the kayak. Uh, yeah, I mean, I know I'm okay kayaking, and you start to encounter mangroves as you get closer to the coast. Uh, And though I wanted to paddle out into the sea, I've actually never done that because fishermen have warned me that it's too dangerous and the currents are too strong. And so we always end our trip at the mouth where the river joins the sea. And it's a great place. And we've seen how the mouth has changed over the years. And now, unfortunately, there's another port being built in a place that didn't need it. Uh, we've seen the beach change every monsoon after every monsoon, and now it's gone because there's an ugly big port coming up. So it's very frustrating to see the river that you loved and the place that you loved being taken over for somebody's grandiose plans. So while we enjoyed kayaking down the Sharavathy, it's now the port being built on it is a huge eyesore. Uh, doesn't serve anybody any purpose. It's pretty destructive ecologically. But yeah, what can you do about it? It's just frustrating.
It must be especially hard since you have both a professional and a very personal connect to this entire river, to estuary, to the sea landscape or waterscape, and it almost seems as though you have a very natural pull towards spending time there, whether it's academically or otherwise. Have you uh, used any of these observations to uh, towards conservation effort or towards trying to convince people otherwise in terms of the developmental activities that you mentioned?
Uh, so a lot of my work has, in the last many years, have been along the Kaveri, and our study there kind of showed us that Kaveri probably hosts one of India's best populations of smooth-coated otters, and despite everything that's happening, otters seem to be still doing pretty well over there. So apart from building contacts with fishermen and fisheries department or forest department officials, not much has been done. Well, the real work that should start over there or along many other rivers probably is to do with habitat restoration or riparian restoration, because a lot of these rivers, so otters, yeah, in some sense otters are generalists. They're able to adapt and survive in very varied and changing riverscapes. But what has probably disappeared and can only be brought back not by not just by community participation but actual work is, see, for example, birds like the fish eagles. You have two fish eagles, the gray-headed fish eagle and the lesser fish eagle along the river. And to me, it's very clear that they need large riparian trees, maybe even a continuous stretch of these large riparian trees to even survive or use the river. And in a good part of the first 220 kilometers of the river doesn't have any of these large riparian trees. And fish eagles are completely absent, except in the wildlife sanctuary, which has beautiful riparian forest, probably India's best riparian forest. And yeah, so for birds like the fish eagles, which depend so strongly on large trees, riverside trees, and for maybe even the black-bellied tern. So the Kaveri probably hosts a very important breeding population of the black-bellied tern. And black-bellied terns need sandbars, large islands in the middle of the river, sandy islands, large sandbanks to nest and survive. And these are the very things sand mining is taking away. So, well, we're all sitting in Bangalore, not Akshay, but the two of us, uh, and we see these flyovers and buildings coming up all around us. And where do you think the sand is coming from for these projects? A lot of the sand that Bangalore consumes comes from just the Cauvery basin alone. And how much can a river give? Well, I kind of keep thinking that the sand we use in Bangalore or the water we use is changing the very nature of interaction between otters and fishermen, or fish eagles and the river, or black-bellied terns and the river. Black-bellied terns don't have the sand that they need. Otters don't have the sand that they need. Fish eagles don't have the trees that they need. And all of this is linked to how we live our lives in the city. So I think a lot of work needs to be done, well, by restoring what was once there, or at least going a step towards it. Bring back the large trees, keep the sand in the river, stop people from building dams, stop intensive fishing or pollution. That's where work should be headed, and mine's hardly made a dent or even a scratch regarding any of these.
Uh, I, I think we both disagree that it has not made a dent or just scratched the surface, because I think just the fact that you have made the first step and put the story out there is probably going to inspire many more people and create seed ideas for others to follow. And the seed idea of restoration that you put up, the riparian restoration, is fascinating, and it seems to be something that has not been explored in India at all as much as it has in the West, except perhaps for Rally for Rivers. Can you? It seems like a great idea on paper, but many ecologists seem to be actually opposing this restoration. And what's your stance on that? And what do you think are the good or the bad things, or are there any good or are there any bad things to it?
Well, I won't go too much into it, but I think it's well, it sounds like a great idea, but I think it's a wrong bunch of people implementing it, or there's not much thought and science behind what they're planning to do. Uh, Nothing is going to happen by planting fruit-bearing trees along the river. Or so the thing is, just by planting trees along the river, you're not restoring the river. This is what they hope to do by planting fruit trees or provide supplement income of farmers. You have to treat the river, the riverbank, the trees, and everything as probably one connected system. And unless you stop sand being removed from some place and just plant trees down river is not going to really help. You have to see it as prohibiting a lot of activities while going ahead with many other activities like planting trees, the right kind of native trees in the right places, or in many places you don't need trees, you need other sorts of vegetation. uh, you don't need dams, you need to, or if there are dams, you need to ensure there is some flow allowed into the river. So Rally for Rivers seems more like a PR exercise to me, aimed at more at collecting funds and with no very little science behind it. Well, by restoration I mean not just planting trees, but I meant restoration as a lot of these activities together, be it stopping sand mining or preventing more dams coming up, uh, changing how intensive fishing is done, stopping dynamite fishing, raising nurseries, working with people. So all of this together is restoration, and not just what media makes it to believe.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear the nuance of this for once and not lost in 140 character battles, now 280 on Twitter. Just I guess to clarify to our listeners what Rally for Rivers is, maybe horse came before the cart, but Jaggi Vasudev and a few other well-meaning people who have a huge fan following have set up this initiative where they're galvanizing people across India and potentially across the Kaveri basin, because they're starting with Kaveri basin and they want to plant trees at very high densities along the Kaveri basin. And the tree species, like Nisarg mentioned, are mostly, fruit-bearing trees.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of what you mentioned, Nisarg, about the changes you've seen over the years, and also the perspective that you have obtained through working with other ecologists and even looking at other projects like Rally for Rivers from a third party perspective. I think you're a great person to ask whether you've seen any change in the ecologist community's priorities and values over the roughly a decade's worth of work that you've been doing, because you are still one of the younger yet well experienced ecologists we have within our community, and you definitely have more insight than either Akshay or I do.
I think a lot has changed. I see a lot of work from people in my peer group, from others, happening in areas that earlier saw very little work out. By that I mean in the plains or non-protected areas along rivers, in agricultural fields. So for me, that's a huge positive that people are now looking in non-glamorous areas, not tiger reserves or wildlife sanctuaries or national parks, but looking everywhere now. So I see that increasing. I've also seen how projects on otters themselves have taken off in the last many years. There are more people talking about otters. There are more people talking about rivers and streams. So much work, really nice work happening on fishes and mini idols and dams. Uh, so I think it's heading in a nice direction. But I don't know in the current uh, scenario of all the clearances being given without hearings, with sham processes. uh, there's clearly a lot more we should do that we're not doing. uh, we've always looked down on activism, uh, in some sense maybe, uh, but I think there's no shame in that. You really have to fight for what you want to conserve, and activists do that pretty well. We say we are ecologists, we are scientists, we rely entirely on science. Science will lead the way, but sometimes you just need to listen to what your heart is saying and go fight for it. So I would love to see a lot more of that. Otherwise, I'm very happy with the direction projects are taking or science is taking, at least in the areas that I look forward to.
Yeah, I think you've hit a very important point that's not often talked about, which is the importance of activism and the importance of following what's in your heart and taking away with it. What immediately comes to my mind is something you said right at the beginning of the podcast, which is how this, in some sense, is the opposite of what science is, right? Where in science you go in with hypothesis, but the data lets you, changes your mind or not about it. So how do you reconcile these two things? Because you, as conservation ecologists, you're doing ecology during the day, and in the evenings you're doing some form of activism. How do you reconcile it personally?
I think for me, in some sense, there's not much to reconcile because my data tells me, if it tells me I'm wrong, I'm willing to listen to it and change my mind. But there are many things which I already have a very strong feeling about, and that for me is enough to drive what I believe in. It could be about being anti-dam or being anti uh, something else. I don't really need data to tell me that building dams is bad. I already know that building dams along rivers is bad, be it a small dam or a large dam. So I tend to follow my heart a lot more and not wait for data always to kick in and uh, guide me to some destination. Does that answer partly what you were trying to ask?
Yeah, I think more than answers, because it just highlights how, like how Sule mentioned. Although there are many problems with what he said, which is that conservation is a crisis discipline where you do your activism, you have follow your heart and common sense, and at the same time you go with what data that you have.
Yeah, and I think it also really helps people like us, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners, to hear you say some of these things, because increasingly ecologists who are of younger ages and who are just getting into the field often have a bit of an imposter syndrome or find it really hard to make peace with their own actions along with what's going on in the world. So I think it's also encouraging to hear some of these things coming from somebody who's been in the field for a while. So we also, I feel like we've gotten into a slightly serious zone of conservation and the more philosophical regions of an ecologist's mind, and I'm going to pull you away from that for a moment to ask you about the guy who was barking while you were talking earlier. So you're very public about your relationship with your dog Noah, and how he's been a support system for you, and I'm sure you have been for him. So we were wondering what it's like for him to be an ecologist dog. I mean, it has to be a unique relationship, right?
uh, Hard to say because there's so much to say. But yeah, Noah, you've both met him. He kind of means the life to me. And he's kind of come and dropped anchor in my life and steadied everything in some sense. Uh, so just to give you a quick background, he's been with me for exactly 5 years now, and I adopted him from a shelter. He was uh, quite badly treated, abused for a few years before that. So it came to me a very different dog, and I sometimes joke to myself saying the only work I've done in the last 5 years is to actually work with him to get him to trust people, to be kind of the dog he is right now. And sometimes, yeah, so having a dog with you changes a lot of things for you. Uh, on the downside, you are somewhat stuck in the city because you can't travel with a large dog. How will you take him, especially when you don't have a car? But it's frustrating. But at the same time, he is like a constant presence. He's like my shadow. He follows me everywhere, and also very protective of me. And I say he's a very empathetic dog because he is constantly by my side, like he can read my mind, and he's there when I need him. He's always around. He's not too far away. Uh, he there's a time when he didn't trust people. He'd bitten many people. People are scared of him. He's the most gentle of gentle dog now. So he's changed my life in many ways, and yeah, he was here giving me a few licks just while I was talking. So yeah, Noah special. I've kind of consciously made him a part of many of my friends' lives because he needs this large circle of people around him to be what he is. And the same, he's been a huge support system for me. He's like my personal therapist. And I believe he is like that to many of my friends as well. I know friends who come home and who feel a lot better being around him, who go back feeling better. He's just there for everybody, and that's a very special feeling to have.
I think having been one of those people in your house, and even with the little interactions that I've been fortunate enough to have with Noah, I tend to agree with you completely. I've always left your house feeling much happier than I was when I got there. And there's no doubt that he's a really special dog. And our listeners should also know that you've written about a very sweet children's story about that relationship, which we can link below as well. So, you mentioned a little bit about what it's like to have a dog in the city and how it does restrict your travels somewhat. Have you ever taken him with you on field? Has he been part of any of your otter surveys before?
So he's not been part of my outer surveys, but he's come with me to field many times. We both spent a month in Valparai, much to the dismay of a couple of my friends over there who don't believe dogs should be there. But yeah, that's a different thing. But he's been with me in Valparai. We've gone on hikes, we've walked on the roads. He's seen some wildlife too. He's come with me to the river a couple of times. He's, I think, seen otters. He didn't care much. He's come with me to the Western Ghats to Cardamone. Spent spent uh, the 10 days there walking around. He loves being outdoors, and the only thing on his mind is when his next walk is, and nothing else matters.
So, Nisarg, I'm also going to, wrap up my side of questions by asking you about two little things. One is about, writing and science communication and creativity when it comes to, talking about the work you do or the kind of person you are. And I think you're a great example from the people we know who goes out of his way to write about his personal and professional side of things. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what an ecologist should do to be more creative with how they talk to people, maybe?
Shucks, I wouldn't be able to answer that because I believe that I wouldn't know what other people should do. I can only speak for myself. For me, I see writing for myself as a very powerful and also uplifting way from where I am currently. Uh, it's a great way to tell my story. And yeah, it's like I can't always write. I will write only when I have a story to tell, and I can't be forced to write. And but when I write, I always make it a point to make it quite personal because when I make it personal, it's something people can relate to because it's something they are going through or would have gone through at some point. And that's how I like to tell my stories of landscape or wherever or whatever I'm writing about to make it as personal and related to my own life as possible.
I think with whatever you've written so far, that's certainly been working because you seem to be touching a lot of hearts with the way you write. And I think it does definitely help to instill a sense of empathy towards a landscape or a species when you write from that very personal perspective. And I think that's great. I hope many more people keep writing the way you do.
We want to end this podcast with a name, place, animal thing, but a slightly different version. Can you share a name of a person, a certain place, a non-human living species, and a tool, a book, or a film that has inspired you? Like we can remind you if you forget one of these.
Well, I will choose from the people I know, and It's not one person, but it'll be two people. They'll. I'm sure you both know them. Divya Modappa and Shankaraman have been great friends and very influential for me. Uh, totally love the work they do and what I've learned from being around them. Your second one was place.
Yep.
The place I'm probably closest to. Well, it's a hard pick, but I spent a lot of time in the Annamalai Hills, and I think I know the landscape really, really well, or at least I used to. Uh, so that comes a close fast, followed by Kaveri, uh, non-human living thing. You said right, the third one,
Yep. Yep.
non-human living thing. My favorite is obviously Noah. I mean, no doubt.
And finally, a book, a film, a technique, a tool, anything that a thing that has inspired you.
Hard because I like many books, and yeah, my favorite probably couple of books is The Tree Where Man Was Born by Peter Matthiessen and Cancer Ward by Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Really powerful sounding books. We should, listeners and ourselves should read.
Well, thanks so much, Nisarg. I think this conversation has been so informative even for Akshay and me, and that's saying a lot considering we know each other pretty well even outside of this podcast. So thanks so much for taking this time and going into the depths of everything you've worked on so far.
Yeah, this was great. And hopefully we'll have you on again and again and again. Obviously not saying the same things, but
Thanks, Akshay. Thanks, Ishika.
we had a great time recording this episode and we hope you enjoyed it too. Thank you for listening.